Wow!
Remarkably Bright Creatures was really born out of curiosity for me. I remember watching a YouTube video of a giant Pacific octopus that was really, really determined to escape from its enclosure in an aquarium. And, I had just started dabbling in writing fiction at the time, and I was kind of in this place of hunting for characters in the wild, and I just thought, wow, that would be a fun character. And as I started to learn more about octopuses, because I didn't know much about them to begin with, other than that they were very smart, I began to become more and more curious about what life would be like on the other side of the glass or the zoo enclosure for an animal that is as remarkably intelligent as a giant Pacific octopus.
Well, when I was growing up, I didn't encounter a lot of fiction that was set in the Rust Belt. And I've been writing ever since I was really little, so I think I internalized the message that writing just doesn't happen there, and I would always set my own work elsewhere, in an imagined land or a place I just visited once. And then as I got into my 20s, I realized that the absence of this fiction was a very good reason to contribute some. And I found that my writing was magnetically drawn back to the Midwest when I moved to New York at the age of 22. So I think the kind of danger of not seeing yourself or your life represented in art is that it sort of divests you of political and creative will. And I wanted to write something, to contribute something that was not meant at all to be a comprehensive treatment of the Rust Belt or Indiana or anything like that, but just one sort of portrait of a place that I knew and felt a lot of tenderness toward. And it was an effort to reclaim a place and a group of people that I felt were quite neglected in the American imagination.
I have lived up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan since 1991, and I grew up in Lower Michigan. I love it in Lower Michigan too, but I absolutely love the UP. And my husband and I we ran a restaurant together up here in the UP for 30 years. We're now running a smaller business together. But both in terms of hiring people, waiting on people, living in a small town, and just living up here in the UP, being part of a small town, I have met so many awesome people in the Upper Peninsula. I feel like the people up here, a lot of them are really special, and I almost feel like they don't make them like this anymore. And I'm sure they do. I'm sure people like awesome people are made all over. They're minted across the world. But I found something very unique and special about the culture up here. People have a really, I feel like overall, very humble and down to earth, very funny, like great outlook on life, um, like, and kind of quiet, maybe quietly forgotten in a way. And I found people that worked with me and people that I just knew, people that I waited on. I saw all these awesome folks who were maybe struggling a lot of different ways, maybe financially, maybe emotionally, whatever. We all do that. But like people who don't often get a voice, and they're so great, and so many great parents. I guess as far as Tin Camp Road, I've seen so many great parents making great, creative, complex, interesting lives for their children, making like these small, wonderful people, and doing it without a huge amount of resources, and being super creative about it and just beautiful. And I wanted to share that because I think sometimes we place too much emphasis on the material aspect of our lives, and we don't give enough credence to the non-material. And I can't think just how I want to say it, but the main character, the mom in this book, she's really struggling. She's struggling to have a home for herself and her daughter. She adores her daughter and wants her to have a great life. to be a great person, to be confident and capable and creative, to love nature, and to love people. She's doing her darndest to make that happen, but it's hard. It's hard for single parent anywhere, and she has trouble keeping a roof over their head a lot of the time. So I wanted to follow their struggles and follow their successes and see if I couldn't. I guess I've thought before, like, open a window onto a world that a lot of people don't know much about,
Mhm.
and peep into this little cabin and this very modest little life and say there's just a lot going on here,
Mhm.
and have people maybe gain a new perspective and listen in a new way and notice people in a new way if they haven't before.
Yeah. This book was inspired by the seven, the aunties who shaped me as a person, who held our family together against all odds. And then, of course, also inspired by the other matriarchs, my two grandmas, Grandma Lola, Grandma Frida, and my mom, and how it all comes together. The women are Midwestern women from the North Woods, the Lake Superior region of Minnesota, and they shape me. They're a part of me. They belong to me, and I belong to them. And so that's why I was inspired to write it.
I was inspired to write Stay and Fight by the richness and variousness of the land in Appalachian, Ohio, and the richness and variousness of the people in Appalachian, Ohio. And I wanted to write a story that embodied the great variety and creativity and resourcefulness of the rural community that I live in.
I recently found the sentences that seeded the family CHAO in my writing log from 2003, and they are: the story takes place in one night. It is a huge dinner party. In 2005, I wrote 100 pages about a Chinese American family living somewhere in the Midwest. The parents were Winnie and Leo Chow. Their longtime marriage was falling apart, and they were planning a divorce party. There were 3 children, one named Ming. And, I enjoyed the present tense voice of the project and the pacing. Also, it was more acerbic. It was like funnier than what I'd been writing. But the project was lacking in a story, so I let it sit for many years while I wrote another novel. But all that time I was reading Fyodor Dostoevsky's great work, The Brothers Karamazov, and I just loved that book. I loved it so much that I had, impromptu grad student classes where we would just sit and talk about that book. I would make them read it, and then we would discuss the novel for hours. And at some point, maybe in 2013, it occurred to me that the present tense narrative voice that I had written the 100 pages in was actually a really good fit with the Brothers Karamazov, as were the characters, and to a certain extent, the tone. The Brothers Karamazov includes a murder and trial. This is something that I had never attempted, and I thought it might be a distracting project for me. Moreover, I was deeply interested at this point in writing about a family in which the immigrant experience had occurred decades previous to the story, but they were still in some ways marked by that experience, identified by that experience, and seen as immigrants. And, the story, I'd say, was a real pleasure to write in many, many ways. And I found it like sort of personally meaningful to me as someone, whose own parents arrived in this country now. They're now gone, but they would have come to the United States 7 decades ago.
Well, in writing this book, it sort of started out as fun and games. I'm writing this cranky octopus narrator, and sort of funny things are happening. But at some point, I think I really started to explore some themes that I myself had grappled with a lot: loneliness, grief, sort of a resistance to letting people help, and an unwillingness to let my guard down. I think those are really some of the themes of Remarkably Bright Creatures, and they are also things that I myself have struggled with, as I've made my way through sort of early and middle adulthood. And I think there are themes that have resonated a lot. One of my main characters is a woman who's in her 70s, and when I was writing the book, I really thought, well, this character is going to be so different from me. She's this Swedish lady. She's just very stoic, and just has a hard time sort of accepting help from her community. And I didn't realize until later that, I was really sort of writing my own story at that time of being a new mom and being in that same boat of having a really hard time accepting that I needed help from my community in order to do this new job that I had sort of found myself in of being a parent. And it's a theme that I feel like has really resonated across a lot of generations and life backgrounds. And, I'd love to say it was all intentional, but it's one of those things that I think just sort of, came together as I was exploring this character's struggles. I was really exploring my own struggles as well.
There was an essay written by Simone Weil that I think about all the time called Attention and Will. I read it when I was 20. And there's a line in this essay where she says that attention taken to its highest degree is the same thing as prayer. And to know that this man who is hungry and thirsty really exists as much as I do, that is enough. The rest will follow. And I think about this line all the time, not just because it guides my fiction, but I try to let it guide my life too. I think if you can really internalize the message that every single person you encounter has an inner life that is as real and vivid and extreme and dramatic and important as yours, it is impossible to mistreat someone, or at least you have to be very, very ill to mistreat someone. And there's a reason why pretty much every world war has to begin with a dehumanizing campaign against the vilified group. As long as you can see other people, as real, important, vivid individuals, then that's the beginning, I think, of justice and kindness. And so everyone has a story, to me, means everybody's inner life is as real as yours.
Like, I'm always drawn in my writing to what you might call ordinary people. And I get a lot of readers who say, I really loved reading about people that really resonate with me. Like, I could see that could have maybe been me, and they're sort of amazed. So I'm a quiet person, and I like the quiet stories. And I'm always intrigued by just ordinary folks. And so everyone has a story. I guess that means even the ordinary folks are just ambling past. I'm always like, I wonder what's up with you. Wonder what's going on, what made you who you are. And if you take the time to listen and pay attention, everybody does have a story. Every life we're all so similar in some ways, and yet we each have our own unique set of experiences and beliefs. And it's the details. I really think it's the details of everything, of life. I mean, it's the details that make writing just pop and shine. And it's the details of people's lives, My husband and I are running a tiny little bakery now, a cottage industry bakery. And right now we're selling our goods out of a little canned hand camper from the early 60s, right? It's so modest and it's random to people that aren't familiar with the area. They're like, what is this doing in the middle of the woods? There's actually a lot of traffic in this middle of the woods. But today I waited on a lady. I sold her a cookie, and she told me about the cookies her mom made her and packed in her lunch as a kid. Gave me the recipe, and then she laughed. She said her best friend's mom sent store-bought cookies, And as a little girl, she preferred her friend's store-bought cookies to her mom's homemade. So she would trade. And it's just little stories like that. They're delightful to me.
In the Ojibwe way, stories are living things. They have a spirit. And when you think about stories as being living things, there are stories everywhere. There are stories inside everyone and about everyone. And when you add to a story or change the voice or bring in new voices, the whole story changes and becomes a new story. And so that's my approach to storytelling, to honor the stories that are inside everyone. When you're speaking to someone in Ojibwe, you're acknowledging that they and you are together, your spirits are together. And so when you think about stories as connecting us and our spirits together, they're very, very powerful entities.
I think it's important to remember that when we're writing, that we're always writing in relationship. So although right now there tends to be a lot of focus on people who are storytellers telling stories directly from their own experience, I think it's also important to remember that as we write what we know, we write into what we don't know. And when we write from our own experience, we're always writing in relationship to our neighbors, our friends, our loved ones, and our communities. So our experiences are deeply intertwined with other people's experiences. Deep listening, deep imagination, and deep participation are required for deep storytelling.
As a child of immigrants growing up in Wisconsin, many, many decades ago, uh, I remember feeling very much like an outsider. And I had the belief, looking at, the television and books around me, at the popular culture, that a story such as mine, as I grew up in Wisconsin, uh, Chinese American girl, would never be told um, in a way that everyone could see it. And that has very much changed during the course of my life. And I like to think that the work I do as director of the Iowa Writers Workshop is a part of that. The workshop is one of the most important arts programs in the country. It's been the heart of American literature for almost 90 years. When I arrived there 32 years ago, I think that it was in many ways dedicated to a specific voice, a specific story. And it's been my goal over the last 17 years to broaden the program to other voices, to create a community of writers, to make it possible for the program to keep its size, diversity, and equal support for all students. And I do believe that it's crucial that places such as the Iowa Writers Workshop continue to provide opportunities to a diverse community of writers and artists so that more stories will be told.
I remember the first book where a character really blew me away, and that was A Prayer for Owen, Meany by John Irving, which I read when I was in my, I think, early 20s. And as someone who really, I'm a character writer, that's the love of writing for me, is creating these characters. I remember just being totally blown away by how this character of Owen Meany, who is, a young boy in the book, could be so simultaneously endearing and annoying and captivating and just sort of all of the things all at once. It was a book that made me think about wanting to be a writer someday. And, I still think about aspiring to that level of character creation, from obviously John Irving is one of the masters of fiction of our era. So I would say that book definitely had a big influence on my path. The other one that comes to mind, and this is going to sound kind of silly, is Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, which is obviously a children's book and one that I read a lot as a child and one that I have read to my own children a lot. But the treatment of animals as protagonists, as beings that can think and talk and create and make change. I think planted a seed in my mind that eventually came to fruition with Remarkably Bright Creatures.
When I was 17, I read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. And I think this was the first book I encountered that proved to me that fiction could have a kind of impact on social justice. Of course, in the time that Steinbeck was writing, fiction occupied a different kind of place in the American imagination in terms of entertainment. But I think it proved to me that it is actually an act of kind of political resistance to inhabit these perspectives of people who are not normally visible on a national scale. And I think that book obviously had policy effects. It actually did change workers' rights and a number of other kind of national attitudes toward migrant workers. And while we face a different kind of climate now, I think fiction at its best is a way to encourage sort of internal, tiny little shifts toward compassion and toward a more ethical life. I think it's not always true that writing and reading makes you more empathetic or makes you a better person, but I do think that the kinds of skills required to write and the skills required to read fiction are some of the same skills that are required to live an ethical life.
I would say it was The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I read it many years ago. I read it in the evenings, mainly after work at the diner. I would read it by the light of the ice cream freezer in the dark diner and eat my pie. And I remember reading, well, for one thing, it was about poor folk. My dad was raised during the Depression in Lower Michigan. His father worked at Fisher Body, and he died probably from lead poisoning young. So the family, there were lots of kids. They were tenant farmers. They got farmed out to family. I mean, luckily there was enough family to take them in, but they were quite poor. They struggled. And I remember stories that my dad told, and he was embarrassed as a kid to be so poor and about his clothes and stuff. And reading along through The Grapes of Wrath, it really made me think of my dad's childhood and his parents. I was raised on a farm, and kind of like plain, but man, we were never hungry. I had private music lessons. I mean, but thinking of my dad. So I got to this section where one of the characters is talking, and he said something about them nice pants kids in town, differentiating the kids with nice pants from themselves. And that was almost exactly something my dad used to say. So it just gave me this whole insight into how you could write about anyone if you try. I mean, obviously I'm not Steinbeck, but I admire him. And I admired how he wrote about these struggling people as complex humans, really complex people. And it inspired me to think maybe someday I could try to do that too. Because a lot of times, I don't know, that he was kind of perhaps a bit groundbreaking in focusing on the poor the way he did. Yeah. And also Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. When I read Man's Search for Meaning, it completely blew me away. I would say it's one of the best books I ever read. And he points out in that book how you can't avoid suffering, but you can impact how you respond to suffering. And that's just like this big basic lesson that everybody, including myself, could stand to learn.
Well, asking an author to choose one book is very dangerous territory. It's a nearly impossible task, but I narrowed it down to 3, and I'll mention 2. Ceremony by Leslie Silko, which was the first time that I read a book where I found myself inside the pages in such a way that I didn't want to leave. Leslie Silko is a masterful writer, and that story just holds up over time. The Power of Stories, it's all in that book. The second one would be The Overstory by Richard Powers. I am from the woods. I live in the woods. I talk to the trees. And reading that book, I mean, I'm just getting the shivers now talking about how Richard Powers put all of that together in a novel, in novel form. It's a masterpiece, and I think a lot of others will agree with me on that. The third one is All About Love by Bell Hooks. That book is everything. Narrowing down the definition of love to the will to nurture one's spiritual path, one's spiritual well-being, along with another's spiritual well-being. That definition of love could potentially transform the world into a whole new place. And again, bell hooks, the power of word, the power of just the power of knowing and understanding humanity the way that bell hooks writes about it is unprecedented, unlike anyone else.
Well, there are so many, it's hard to even know where to start, but I thought I'd forefront a Ohio writer that I always think deserves more attention, Virginia Hamilton, who wrote MC Higgins the Great. So she was writing, MC Higgins the Great is a children's novel, and it's set in Appalachian, Ohio. And one thing that it changed for me is thinking about the borders between what we call children's literature and what we call adult literature. Because as I was reading MC Higgins the Great aloud to my children, I just thought, line for line, this novel is as moving and expansive and deeply felt and complicated as anything that I could ever hope to write. And I think we should all be reading it. I mean, she's a stylist. She's a consummate stylist, and she does what I'm always interested in doing, which is listening deeply to the colloquial and spoken language around her, and offering that as worthy of high style on a prose level.
Okay. I grew up reading the book Little Women by Louisa May Alcott as a kind of, I mean, even then I knew it was a cleaned up autobiography story of her childhood. And as I grew older, I came to understand that this was the autobiography, essentially, of a 19th century American woman who became a commercially successful writer in an era when so many things were against her. For one thing, she'd grown up in a complex utopian transcendentalist environment in which the valued members of the community, including her father, were predominantly male. She was supporting her entire family after living through a childhood that was financially deprived, in large part because of the ideals of that father. Also, on a fundamental level, I understood the story about four sisters because I, too, am from a family of four sisters. And the March sisters' imaginative lives, their vanities, deprivations, and indulgences, their poverty, their ambitions, their successes and failures fascinated me because they were familiar to me, and because the book gave me a kind of perspective that helped me understand that someday I would be able to see it all through the eyes of a storyteller.
I grew up in the mountains, and I always thought I would never love anywhere as much as I have loved the mountains, but I love the prairie in Illinois so much. I live in the suburbs of Chicago, right next to a large park that has a lot of native grasses and areas that the city has really tried to preserve as native prairie grassland. And it is so fascinating to me the way that the prairie can change moods depending on the season, the light, You know, seeing it go from absolutely nothing being, you know, burned down to the ground in late winter to this thriving environment that is so full of different plants and different light, and, you know, changes almost by the day with what flowers are in bloom, which ones are on their way in and way out. I'm so captivated by it. I spend a lot of time sitting at my kitchen table, you know, writing and looking out on the prairie that we can see from our backyard. And I find it so, so inspiring. And the sunsets on the prairie really cannot be beat anywhere.
So many things come to mind. I love so much about Indiana. The first thing that came to mind was the farmers market in my hometown, South Bend. I used to work there. I worked at a bakery and they had a stand there, and so I would spend a lot of my summers, really all year round. I would spend a lot of time at that market. And what I loved so much about it was that it was a place where people from all walks of life really came together, and it was a very social, very kind place. People were really open to each other there. And there were tons of people who would come and they wouldn't buy anything. They just came because it was their kind of church. It was community for them. And a lot of people would stop by my stand and tell me their stories of their lives. And for me, this was a really a kind of time of communal awakening for me. It was the time that I realized the kind of range of lives that were available in my hometown. Very often these were people who were older, so they had a lot of stories to tell, and they'd seen a lot of changes over the course of their lives. So I love that market, but there's so much else I love, and summer thunderstorms, the dunes, but really it always comes back to the people.
I love Michigan. After college for a little over a year, I lived in upstate New York, and it was cool. It was a good experience, but man, I was homesick. So I cannot pick just one thing, but I love the Great Lakes. I just love the greenness and the wateriness of Michigan. Overall, I love the people of Michigan. I love the history. There's so much history here of Michigan. And I think the Great Lakes and the waterways and all the history, I don't know, but I love the history of the Native Americans. It's so accessible. You can find that history, living history. And I think a lot of the Native American tribes in Michigan are among the few in the country that weren't ever removed from their ancestral lands. So that history is just like thousands of years deep with people, you know. I love Mackinac Island. I love all the history there, as well as the fudge. Gosh, I love the UP, the porcupines, all the waterfalls up here. I love Belle Isle. Belle Isle Aquarium, awesome spot. I love Eastern Market, man, down in Detroit. I love how really connected, if you start to read, like on the waterways from all the way up here by the Sioux, down through Mackinac Island, down to Detroit. It's like this giant highway of water and people and trading and movement.
Yeah. So many wonderful things about Minnesota. Born and raised here on the North Shore of Lake Superior. I am all about the water. Lake Superior, the largest freshwater lake. And so my favorite place is going to be anywhere on the shore of Lake Superior, whether you're in a boat or you're just walking around, or you're wading in the water, or you're swimming in the warm beaches across the lake in Cornucopia, Wisconsin. Lake Superior it is Minnesota.
I love living in the Ohio Hills. I love how it surprises people. I love how contradictory and complicated it is. I love how it embodies so many contradictions and complications of what people in the US experience as a whole. It's kind of a microcosm. And I love the freshwater spring in Booktill, and right down the hill from there is an amazing a gas station that has the most amazing fried chicken that I've ever had. So it's a perfect date. You just bike out to the Bookdale Spring, drink some fresh water, go down to the gas station, get the best fried chicken you've ever had, and maybe shoot a few hoops on the ball fields.
My favorite thing about Wisconsin is the light of the North. And I can feel it driving north from Iowa, where I now live. Iowa, which is in gardening zone 5. I grew up in northeastern Wisconsin, where the temperature is 5 to 10 degrees colder than in Iowa, and we're in gardening zone 4. The leaves come later. Halloween is colder. The midwinter is frigid in a way I feel sentimental about now, because I live in Iowa. And as I drive north from Iowa and we reach gardening zone 4, a more northern zone, a colder zone, the color of the light changes and it begins to remind me of my childhood. The shades of blue in the sky, the increasing presence of pine trees, deciduous trees, the blue lakes, the landscape. It all reminds me of my childhood.